What I want to talk to you today about is one of the most difficult things in human existence. It's very rare and it's hard to come by and it's hard to display, especially in a Christian's life. I'm just kidding with you. What I want to talk to you today about is love. You know, there was an old song that came out years ago, "What the world needs now is love, sweet love." I love that song because of what it says. You know, with wars and demonstrations and corruption, division, broken homes, broken marriages, racial divide, ethnic and religious division, we really need love in our world. In and amongst our own people, in and amongst our own towns and families. I can't imagine a world completely filled with love. It would be, I don't even know how to describe it. I don't even know how it would feel to be in a world where people actually loved one another's neighbors, loving one another's, no hatred, no bitterness, no strife, no resentment and jealousies, but just real, genuine love. I look at our society today and I realize that we have largely forgotten how to love. What is love anyway? Well, you look at it up in the Webster's and it says a strong affection or warm attachment. That just doesn't quite do it for me. I mean, love is a lot more than that, isn't it? And as you grow older, you find out love has many facets. You know, from the third grade or second grade or third grade attachment you might have with the girl across the room or the guy across the room. And you blush when you even think that they're looking at you, you know, the embarrassment that you feel, the uncomfortableness of even talking to the opposite sex, to growing up as a teenager and going through puberty and all of that and what that entails. And some people are affected years later by something that happened to them dramatically because of a relationship at a very early age. And it's very difficult. All of us have gone through that and experienced it. But then you find a mate, you find someone that loves you and you love them and you get married and you grow together and you learn and you grow up together as we often did. Most of us, my age group, got married very early, 18, 19, 20 years old. We had children very quickly and you know, we sort of growing up raising kids and we wasn't even grown up ourselves. But we were forced to grow up and learn about each other and learn to love each other and learn to accept the faults and difficulties of the other person and maybe the faults and the shortcomings that each of you have that you didn't know about when you were dating, you know, and you saw each other 2 hours a week. And now you're together, you know, 24/7. It's quite different, isn't it? You're living under one roof and you can't go anywhere when it's raining. And you're out of money, so you don't have money to go anywhere. So you're forced to stand and look at each other at your worst. Oh, I didn't know they look like this when they get up in the morning, you know. But we sort of overcome those things, and then you begin to grow into a more mature love, and you find out that love has a really great depth that isn't just based on physical things. It is about care. It's about concern. It's about willingness to devote time and effort to you and without anything in return. We talked a little bit about this last night. The unselfishness of being totally giving to another person. And to do that, you know, it requires a two-way street. I always say marriage is not a 50-50 deal. It's 100%, 100%. Both of you have to give 100% all the time. And it's when we get hot and tired and fatigued and grouchy and hungry and cold or whatever it is that we sort of fall below that bar, and the other one is like, what happened to you? You know, only moments ago you were fine. Now you're, you know, do I need to feed you? Do I need to get you something to eat or whatever? What is it? You know, I've been through all facets of that in my life, in my marriage of now 43 years, I guess. Judy and I have been married for almost 43 years now. And we've learned to overcome those things, you know, and realize that we deeply love each other anyway. with all of the faults that I have. I'm glad she still loves me, and I still love her with the things that maybe she considers to be shortcomings. You know, poets have tried to express, and I love to read some of the poetry. I was going to read some of it to you today, but I really didn't want to get into a long, session of poetry here. But one of the poems was, how do I love you? Let me count the ways. And they start talking about all the depth and the height and the emotion and the, I love you in the candlelight and the bright light and the moonlight. I mean, just every aspect of their life. You could tell by reading this poem that they are infatuated and they deeply love this person that they're talking about. And they're trying with the best ability that they have with a pen to express what's going on inside of them. And it's very difficult to do. Some people can master it. Some people are great at writing poetry that you can read it and you just, wow, it really brings out feelings in your own heart and mind. Songwriters have done it. Some of those songs will bring you to tears. I mean, when you listen to them, it's like, what? This guy he must have been madly in love to come up with those words. Or some lady, that sings some expression of how she feels, and many times it's out of heartbreak. Country western music wouldn't live if it wasn't for heartbreak, right? Painters have tried to put it on canvas. I've seen paintings that took my breath away because they portrayed the scene between a man and a woman and the companionship or the closeness that they had, and they were trying to express what they themselves perhaps felt or yearned for or had one time in their life. Sculptors have done this. I saw a white marble sculpture over in the Louvre. I could not take my eyes off of it. It was a figure of a young lady, and she was in solid white marble. It looked so natural and so flowing and so gracious that it was moving. And I thought, man, what a sculptor. What a message this is telling me. And I felt the feeling of that. And I appreciated the artist that did that. If you don't know what love is, ask your teenager. They can't tell you either. They'll try, but I don't think they know either. They'd have a difficult time, and they'd say, oh, Dad, shut up. I'm not in love. Be quiet. Don't tell me any of that. I don't want to hear it, and I certainly don't want to talk to you about it, Or ask a young man and a woman who's just fallen in love to explain what love is. They know they have this gut feeling, this sensation, this desire for each other, but they can't really explain it to you. We love each other, but we don't know how to explain how that happened. How can you explain what love is? I wrote here, even with my faults, even knowing who I am, or even how I look, they love you anyway. The person that is in love with you loves you anyway, and they care for you when you're sick. They do things for you. They lift you up. Their companionship, their friends, their lovers, they look into your heart and they try to find the good and bring it out in you. And when the rest of the world could care less. That's real love. That's true love, I believe. Other forms of love exist that aren't maybe romantic love between a man and a woman. I've seen and read stories. I've not seen, but I've read stories of soldiers that threw themselves on a grenade to save their buddies in war. Blew themselves up to save the few friends he had in a foxhole. I've seen and read stories and pictures of cars that went over into a lake and a mother clutching a child, pushing them up above the water, and she drowned and the baby survived. Now that is sacrifice. That's love. People have jumped into flowing streams. I see these videos now. It's so popular now to see these extreme videos, but you'll see a fireman or some individual out on the street jump into a flowing, flooding stream to save another human being, knowing that they're probably going to drown themselves. That is unbelievable courage and love and concern for another human being. It's amazing to me to see those. In Genesis, the 45th chapter, one of my favorite stories that always brings me to tears when I read it, Genesis 45. I won't read the whole story because I don't have time, but this is the story where, you remember, Joseph was the youngest, the most favorite of his father. He was given a coat of many colors. All the other brothers were jealous of him. And he started popping off about some of these dreams he was having, and they just absolutely began to hate him. And of course, they sold him into slavery. Now, I don't know how bitter that hatred had to become for him as a 17-year-old boy. Now, you have a 17-year-old younger brother, and you've got tired of his lip, so you decide to sell him one day and tell Dad that he got killed by wild animals. That's pretty horrendous, isn't it? A little 17-year-old young man was sold into slavery, and he disappears, and they don't see him again for 22 years. And so we come up on the scene of a great famine, and you know what all happened in Joseph's life, how he went and spent 2 years in prison. He was accused falsely of having some sort of a relationship with a woman. And not only was he finally out of prison after 2 years, but he began to work his way up through Pharaoh's ranks, and he became second only to Pharaoh, or third. He was like a visor right there in the palace. Now, have you ever gone back and looked at pictures of kids you went to school with in your old almanac or whatever, and then you see them 40 years later or 25 years later? Some of them you can't even recognize, can you? You think, what happened to all that curly hair, and you were thin as a pencil, and you had a big extended chin, and now all of a sudden they look normal. They've grown up, they've matured, their body has filled out, and you don't even recognize them. After 22 years, Joseph's brothers came down to Egypt to buy food, and they were brought in because they came in from a foreign country. They were brought in before Joseph, and they didn't even recognize their own brother. The story is fascinating, what he did to them, how he played these little games with them, and he put things in their packages and sent them out, and then he accused them of stealing and brought them back. And then, they finally kept one of the brothers, and Benjamin, the youngest brother, and sent them away to their father to report what happened, that they kept Benjamin in Egypt, and now Jacob comes all the way down to Egypt. And there's this moment here, which is the climax of the story, in which Joseph is about to make himself known to all of his brothers. He says in verse 1 of chapter 45, then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him. And he cried, cause every man to go out from me. He said, all you guards and advisors, out of here. And they all left, and his brothers were standing there probably wondering what is about to happen, what's going on. And there stood no man with him while Joseph made himself known unto his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph. Does my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at they were dismayed. They were in shock. They were standing there with their mouths open, and this man is saying he's Joseph, and they couldn't believe it. It wasn't real to them. And Joseph said unto his brethren, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Now, therefore, be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. When I read this story, I think of the story of Jesus Christ, who came to this earth, and he came before his brethren. But there's going to come a time, too, when Jesus himself will be standing there, and there will be those that actually participated in his destruction and betrayed him, and he's going to eventually be there after the resurrection and see these people before him. And I believe you see a little insight here into the story of Jesus, that I came before so that you might have life. He actually did say that. And he will be there with open arms, I believe, and say, don't worry. Whatever happened, happened. I did this for you. I was here. God sent me here for you. Now, be not afraid. He said, preserve your life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land. Of course, the reunion there is absolutely lovely. I really love the way that Joseph opened up his heart to his brothers, even though they did him dirty. I mean, in a bad way. And he's been in Egypt all this time and probably missed his brothers and missed his parents and missed his home, and now he's showing this great love for them, and I'm sure they were all astounded. Down in verse 15 it says, moreover he kissed all of his brethren and wept upon them, and after that his brethren talked with him. And I bet there was an incredible reunion. In 1 John, the 4th chapter, it tells us that God is love. It's hard to imagine that. You know, when you think about a God that's powerful enough to rule the universe, you know, we think of somebody that has all the great power in the world and the universe would be austere and would be, you know, mean and unapproachable. And yet the Bible tells us that God is love, and that Jesus Christ was actually the manifestation of love itself. That is hard to contemplate. How can we then be godly or godlike if we have no love in our hearts? You know, God said, and Jesus actually said this in the famous John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. In Matthew 25, Jesus gives us an example here of how human beings ought to treat one another, how they ought to act towards one another. Matthew 25, down in verse 34. Matthew 25. You get there with you, or get there with me, Matthew 25. And picking this up, I guess, he gives this parable here of the talents, but then he goes into this story and says down in verse 34, then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Here's a great promise here. You can actually go back and look at all the promises that were made in the New Testament by Jesus. There are many of them where he said, he that believeth on me shall not perish, but he will have everlasting life. Those that, I'll raise him up at the last day. There are many promises that he made. This is one of them. For I was hungry, and you gave me meat, and I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in, naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me, and I was in prison, and you came unto me. You visited me. Then shall the righteous answer and say, Lord, when saw we these hungered and fed thee, thirsty and gave thee drink? When saw we thee stranger and took you in, or naked and clothed you? Or when saw we you sick or in prison, or came unto you? And the king shall answer and say unto thee, verily I say unto you, insomuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. I think that says volumes about the judgment of God at the end of days, when he looks into your life and determines what you did. What was your life about? What did your life consist? Look what he says in verse 41 on the other hand. Then shall he say unto them that were on the left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Wow, what a contrast. You talk about the dividing line between sheep and goats here. And it had largely to do for their lack of love and empathy and concern for other people. We cannot be guilty of that. We cannot. And of course, he goes on to repeat all of those things again. And he says down in verse 45, then shall he answer them, verily I say unto you, insomuch as you did it not to one of these least of these, you did it not to me. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. I mean, that is setting the bar up there, isn't it? That is a challenge for each of us to have that kind of wonderful love for each other. In Mark, the 12th chapter, in verse 38, let's go to Mark, the 12th chapter, down in verse 38. We talked a little bit about this last night, too, about hypocrisy and the sin of hypocrisy. And he said unto them in his doctrine, beware of the scribes which love to go in long clothing and love salutations in the marketplace. This is Mark 12, verse 38. And the chief seats in the synagogues and the uppermost rooms of feasts, which devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers, these shall receive greater damnation. These people love the attention. They're very selfish. They love attention. They want to be first, the highest, the best, and all of that in their seating, wherever they are, the best parking spot, whatever it is. And I use that as a sort of the other side of the coin from where a person who is righteous and someone who is humble and someone who is living by God's standard should live. How do we learn what love is then? And where did it originate? Where did love originate? In John, the 15th chapter, let me go back here to John, the 15th chapter. John 15, verse 12. Let's see. Oh, I'm in the wrong book. No wonder. I was like, that doesn't sound right. John, the 15th chapter, verse 12. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. A greater love has no man than this, than he lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. From henceforth I call you not servants, for the servant knows not what his Lord does. But I have called you friends, for all things that I've heard of my Father I've made known unto you. You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatsoever should remain, that whatsoever you shall ask of the Father in my name, he may give it you. These things I commanded you, that you love one another. And of course, what he's essentially saying is here, I am going to lay down my life for you. That's how much love Jesus Christ had for not only his disciples here, but for the world. He just laid it all out there. He's like the soldier that jumped on the grenade. He gave up his life for each of us. In Ephesians 5 and verse 2, read a couple here what Paul wrote about love. Ephesians 5 in verse 2. Pick it up in verse 1. But you, therefore, followers of God, as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also hath loved us and hath given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor. I guess when it was all over with, God looked down at that sacrifice and he was well pleased at his son, what his son did for the world. Because he actually gave his son because he loved the world so much. In Romans, the 13th chapter, it tells us to love one another. Maybe we should go there and read that. Romans, the 13th chapter, back just a few pages here. Romans 13 and verse 8. Romans 13 and verse 8. He talks about all of these characteristics here about the ministry. Let us wait on ministering, and he that exhorts, he that gives, he that rules. But look down in verse 9. Let love be without dissimulation, without hypocrisy, not fake love, not good weather friends. That it's easy to be that way, and it's easy to have friends that love you when everything's good, but boy, when things get bad and you go bankrupt, or you crash your car and you don't have a car to drive, or your house burns down, now you can't find anybody to help you. be without dissimulation, abhor that which is evil, cleave to that which is good. I think that's a great example. Verse 10, be kindly affectioned one to another with brotherly love. God talked about that, or Jesus talked about that agape love. You remember he asked Peter one time, do you love me? Now this is one man asking another man, do you love me? I had a conversation on the phone here not too long ago with one of my high school buddies. He says, when we were in high school, we never told each other we love each other, did we? And I said, no, we'd have got beat half to death, this wine. He said, why is that? And I said, well, there was a stigma, of expressing any kind of, any kind of affection towards another male student, that would be inappropriate, maybe. It is today. But he says, I've learned at my age now to learn to tell people I love them, school classmates, men or women, because I may not get to see them again. And we've lost so many out of our class of 1979 that every time I see somebody from our class, I'm going to tell them I love them. And I said, that's great, man. I think that's an excellent example there. He says, be kindly affectionate one another with brotherly love in honor, preferring one another. But Peter, here's a grown man that asked another grown man, do you love me? It was a little uncomfortable, I would imagine, for the first time. Peter was he was the rambunctious type. He was the outgoing type. He was the one first to speak. He didn't need anybody to love him. And he didn't need to express love to anybody, maybe to his wife, and that was secretly. And here's a grown man asking him, do you love me? Made him very uncomfortable. Yeah, I love you. And I could just see him, and Jesus again, do you love me? Yes, I already said I love you. Didn't you hear me the first time? Do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. I mean, you talk about zeroing in with the magnifying glass. He really wanted to get out of Peter what he was asking him. I don't think Peter had ever had anybody do that before. Certainly be uncomfortable, wouldn't it? To be interrogated that way. But I mean, he had to strip away all of the defenses, didn't he? And say, yes, I truly do love you. I think that is what Jesus was looking for in him. And I think that is exactly what he's looking for in each of us. 1 Corinthians, we'll go over here to 1 Corinthians, the 16th chapter. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 14. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 14. This is the close of Paul's letter to Corinth, the first letter that he wrote. And he said, let your things be done with charity. Let all your things be done with charity or love. I beseech you, brethren. And he goes on to talk about all of these people, sort of gives a closing salutation here, but he's exhorting them to everything you do, let love be there in the forethought of your mind. Is what I'm about to do really out of love? This phone call I'm going to make, or what I'm about to tell this person, or how I'm going to treat this person, or what I'm about to do, is it out of love? It certainly should be the question that is asked. And Paul is an example in 2 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, verse 4. We can look at that too. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 4. And this Paul is sort of summing up his ministry here to the Corinthian church. He says, but in all things improving ourselves as the ministers of God, in much patience, in afflictions, in necessity, in distresses. Now Paul went through a lot. He said, I bear in my body the evidence that I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. He was beaten with rods. He was whipped. He was stoned nearly to death, or perhaps some say he actually was stoned to death and was revived. In stripes, in imprisonments, he was in prison several times, in tumults, in labor, in watchings, in fastings, by pureness, by knowledge, by long-suffering, by kindness, by the Holy Spirit, by love unfeigned. That's without hypocrisy. True love. He loved the brethren, and he told them, I pray for you. By the word of truth, by the power of God, by the armor of righteousness on the right hand and on the left, by honor and dishonor, by evil report and good report, as deceivers and yet true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying and behold we live, as chastened and not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing all things. You don't have to be rich to be rich. To be rich in what Paul had. I mean, he gave it all up. He gave up his power, his position, his citizenship, his authority in the Jewish community, his future, where he probably would have been maybe the high priest someday with all the royalty and all of the, accolades. He gave it all up. And here he is out here mending tents, trying to make it by while preaching the gospel message. And everybody that he took it to practically hated him for it. And yet there were those that did hear and did listen and did follow him. I want to read 1 Peter, the 4th chapter. I did want to get this one in because this is sort of a promise here of having this attitude of love for your fellow brethren and your friends and your family. 1 Peter 4 and verse 7. 1 Peter 4, verse 7. But the end of all things is at hand. Now, we've been preaching that in the Church of God my whole life. We have to be careful. We've always used caution when trying to preach the sky is falling, because people hear it for 20 years and they say, well, this guy's a nut. He don't know what he's talking about. There is going to come a time when the end will come. I don't know when that is. I thought it would have happened years ago, but it hasn't happened yet, but it is going to happen. It will eventually come, and that generation that is alive will experience that event. He said, the end of all things is at hand, but be ye therefore sober and watch unto prayer. And above all things, have fervent charity or love among yourselves. For charity shall cover a multitude of sins. Now that, only God can forgive sin, and only by the blood of Jesus Christ can we be forgiven of sin. And maybe he was referring to that when he said it was out of love that God gave his son and shed his blood for us so that we might be saved and forgiven. But he also has, I think, a secondary meaning here, that your acts of love, as we read about the king who came back and said, if you've done it to the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me, that somehow covers some of the bad things that you did in your life. It seems to be that way. It seems to indicate that to me, that the pile, the mound, the mountain of love that you have certainly overshadows the imperfections and things that you have in your life. And when you weigh it in the balances, God says, you're well done, my good and faithful servant. I think he looks at that and he says, it certainly outweighs the flaws that you have in human nature. It seems to indicate that to me. From the beginning, God expressed sincere love. And in John, the 1st chapter, 1 John 4, it says, God is love. I want to close here. I don't even have to tell you where I'm turning to, do I? I think everybody knows this chapter. It's called the love chapter. It's 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter. And I don't know where Paul got the vocabulary, or whether out of what experiences he had in his life to write this chapter. But it is some of the most beautiful poetry in all of the Bible. He says, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and I have not charity, I am become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mystery and have all knowledge, And though I have the faith so that I could remove mountains, and I have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all of my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profits me nothing. Charity suffers long and is kind. Charity envies not. Charity vaunts not itself. It's not puffed up. It does not behave itself unseemly. It seeks not her own, is not easily provoked, thinks no evil, rejoices not in iniquity, but it rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Charity never fails. But whether they be prophecies, all they'll fail. Whether there be tongues, they will cease. Whether there be knowledge, it'll vanish away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. But now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. And now abides faith, hope, and charity. These three. But the greatest of these is love.